G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to War Thunder. Today, I'd like to start, or perhaps continue, a discussion on whether air-to-air missiles such as the AIM-7 should be accessible to planes in War Thunder. Right now, as it stands, we currently have the F-4C, which is capable of carrying them. I believe there are other planes. The F-3D is also capable of carrying them, well, a modified version was at least. And we also have other provisions or planes that could potentially be added in the current scope of the game that carry AIM-7s. Alternatively, in the future, we could get other planes such as F-16s and so on that are capable of carrying the AIM-120, which is a radar-guided beyond visual range missile. Currently, as it stands, though, we are limited to the F-4C, which has AIM-9Es at the moment. And you might think that that is a pretty bad decision, but we'll get into it in a moment. And it might actually be the wisest decision. So, as it currently stands, the only plane at the moment at top tier, meaning 10.0 or above, hypothetically, is the F-4C. The F-4C was in fact designed with AIM-7s in mind, having a recess bay along the fuselage. And not to have it in War Thunder seems a little disappointing. In the background footage, you'll see one game in the F-4 Phantom and one game in the MiG-21. And you can see that even though that I do quite well in both games, it tends to be either pure luck or guns that get me the kills. Currently in War Thunder, the gun meta is still pretty relevant. It hasn't quite shifted towards a missile meta. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, we'll discuss what could possibly be added. First of all, on the F-4C itself, you could have the AIM-7D. This would be a beyond visual range missile that would be guided by the plane's onboard radar, and you would have to keep, especially for the early ones, I believe the AIM-7B and possibly the AIM-7D, you would have to keep the target on focus the whole time. You would have to keep the nose and the radar pointed towards the target, and you would not be able to break contact. Otherwise, the missile feed would go dry, and the missile would continue straight on its last designated pathway. It wouldn't do any damage, and it certainly wouldn't detonate on its target, and it would not reach home. This seems kind of reasonable, because having a beam-riding missile would kind of be balanced. Beam-riding missiles were originally designed to target bombers and large targets that, you couldn't really intercept with guns. In War Thunder, we don't really have bombers that we can intercept. Sure, we have the F-4 Phantoms doing thunder runs, and we have a couple of Muppets deciding to climb to space every now and then, but it doesn't really come to that a lot. Very often you'll find high-speed, low-level dogfights. And to be honest, an AIM-7 with beam-riding capabilities would be a little bit useless. It's very easy to get a break in the radar lock, especially if you're at low altitude. All you have to do is travel below 1,000 meters and you have a radar lock miss. It doesn't work. Sometimes it will refuse to work. In some cases, where there are mountains, it'll mean that you will have to be extremely careful. You have to be against someone who is at really high altitude, and honestly, the missile would be largely useless. There are no bombers to hunt. Space climbing is pretty easily dealt with the MiG-21, the MiG-19, and the F-4 Phantom. Even the F-100 has the capability to deal with slower targets at altitude with 4 AIM-9Es. There aren't any space bombers in War Thunder. In fact, there are no jet bombers beyond Tier 5. Sure, you might classify the Vautour in the French tech tree as some sort of bomber at a Tier 6 level, having air-to-air missiles, although it is Tier 5. There really are no long-range heavy bombers at top tier, and whilst that is a very good thing for fighter gameplay, and in general is more of an appropriate way to deal with War Thunder's top tier combat, since bombers don't really have a place in the game, it renders the AIM-7 useless. There really is no place for long-range, beyond visual range missiles in War Thunder, because there are simply no bombers to intercept, which is the main role of the initial or the early radar-guided missiles. On top of that, you have potentially one tech tree that can be equipped with this technology. We saw this with the Shilka, the Tunguska, and it wasn't really that great. It pretty much made one nation completely overpowered for 2 patches, which sucks, because what we want to see in War Thunder is balance and parity across nations, across tiers, across everything. And so, having a single nation that gets a single overpowered or extremely good missile where it can't really use it seems a little bit odd. But then again, you look at the Swift. The Swift F7 will soon be getting its beam-riding missiles, and whilst they're probably going to be worse than the infrared missiles, you can see that at least has some application. At battle rating 8.7, you'll be facing Tu-4s, and Tu-4s are probably the last heavy bomber that really gives people headaches at that tier. Sure, it might be in a full down tier, but at the same time, the Swift F7 isn't going to be nearly as fast as something like an F100. So if you want to camp in space with an F100, you have that opportunity. But as time goes on, and at top tier, you get better planes that are capable of camping in space where the F4 isn't, such as at higher altitudes of beyond 14,000 meters, you will eventually, in time, get a use for the AIM-7s. You'll be able to shoot down a slow-moving, relatively speaking, perhaps bomber-like plane, or a plane that is carrying ordnance or something of that sort, but you won't really have that opportunity in today's version of War Thunder. Maybe they'll add certain supersonic bombers, maybe they'll add certain planes that are designed to stay at altitude, but for the time being, it really doesn't work. You can see that guns are still the meta, and missiles are really only an afterthought, especially when it comes to this level of dogfighting, and it kind of reflects the history behind it. The same reason as to why the F4E got a Vulcan cannon in the nose instead of, the gun pods on the F4C was because they realized that missiles at this period of time are simply not reliable enough. In the 80s and in the late 70s, they get really good. You get AIM-9Ls, you get much better, infrared systems, you get better radar-based systems as well. But as it stands, early AIM-7s, which are the radar-guided ones, would be largely useless. And I can see why Gaijin might not want to add them to the game, because having a missile that seems all cool and shiny, but at the end of the day is only for one nation with zero application to the game, and practically no real benefit to the plane, you honestly might as well, in the current situation, carry the 3 gun pods, rather than carrying AIM-7s, because there is practically no situation that you can use the AIM-7s better than the gun pods. Perhaps, yeah, sure, maybe if someone's a lot faster than you, but that really doesn't matter at this point in the game, as it currently stands, because the F4C is quite literally the fastest plane in the game. Until something like higher tier bombers, which I personally do not want to see, because it will practically affect the gameplay in a negative way, unless they come to the game, which I really hope they don't. The AIM-7 at the current stage, or in a beam riding form, really wouldn't do a whole lot. The real issue is when you start to get the better ones. I'm told that the AIM-9D and the AIM-9E would be roughly well balanced. They would kind of similarly perform to perhaps an AIM-9E, except at longer range, and might be a little bit better at turning because they can bleed a lot more speed because they're big, fat, heavy missiles, and so they can perform a higher G turn. I really don't think that they're going to have much of a use, because once again, in this current situation, an AIM-9E or an AIM-9B will do just the same. In fact, it might even do it better because it's a lot smaller and is a lot more hard to spot. In the current situation, the meta for War Thunder jets at the moment is make them turn with a missile, bleed them to low speed, and then finish them off with the guns. The AIM-7, as it currently stands, just as the 4 AIM-9E loadout, doesn't really make it a great loadout. It's not that great. And as much as the AIM-9Es are good missiles, and as much as the SRAMs are fantastic missiles, doesn't really mean that the missile meta will, at this point in the game, and at this point in history and technology, will really overtake guns. It will take a few more missiles, perhaps slightly better AIM-7s, perhaps early Russian ones, that I'm not sure what the names are, but, at this point in the game, we get to a point where missiles are either going to be not good enough, or they're going to be broken overpowered. The SRAMs are currently quite strong as they are, but can you imagine an AIM-9L on a jet, where you will need to quite literally outrun it, and maybe you'll have to even deploy flares at range to get even the slightest chance of it not locking you and killing you. The plane itself is still the main feature. The missiles, if they get too overpowered or if they get too powerful, will ruin the game. The only reason why the SRAMs are balanced is because at 9.7, they're not on a great plane. I've made this clear in my previous video on the Hunter F6. The chassis of the Hunter, or the airframe rather, is not really that spectacular compared to others. It's the SRAMs that literally make the plane. Otherwise, it would be practically useless. If it was on perhaps the F100 or the F4C, the SRAMs would be brutally overpowered. And so having missiles that are strong is really not the way to go. What we need to see is some new mechanic, like a countermeasure or anything else, perhaps like electronic warfare, something that jams a radar, perhaps, or something that fools a heat seeker. Maybe, I don't know how it might work. I don't know what the possibilities are, and that's why I'd like you to let me know in the comments below what could possibly be added to War Thunder to make higher-end radar-guided missiles not overpowered. Because as it currently stands, beam riding types are going to be way too bad, and some of the earlier versions will actually be awful. They will have no application, and there is really no place in the meta. Sure, they'll be cool, they'll be shiny, but there really isn't anything for it in the game. Anyway, ladies and gents, that'll do for today. Thank you very much for watching. Do let me know in the comments because I really want to know what you think. Take care, and I'll catch you next time.